So in this section I want to talk about data types, and every single piece of data that you put into a database, into a table, has to be assigned a data type. Now there's a bunch of data types, but there's three main categories, and that is numeric data types, obviously numbers, integers, floating points, and then we have strings, which is basically text, and date and time data types. And before we go into the basic data types from those categories, I want to talk about what signed and unsigned means. And the numeric tiny int, small int, medium int, and big int all have signed and unsigned versions. And basically unsigned is it can have negative numbers. An unsigned data type can't have negative numbers, but it has twice as large of a range than signed data types. All right, twice as large as in a positive range. Signed data types have twice as less of a positive value, but they can have negative types. Okay, negative numbers of values. And you can see down here we have an example. An int, which is by default signed, it can go from this number, which is a negative number, all the way to this positive number. If it's unsigned, then it can't have any negative numbers, so it starts at 0, but it goes to double the signed value. Okay, so I hope that's clear. Now let's get into the three categories. So first we have our numeric data types. We have an int, which is probably the most common numeric data type. This is a normal sized integer. It can have up to 11 digits, which is a very, very high number. Tiny ints are very small integers, 0 to 255, and can have a width up to 4 digits. It's a synonym for Boolean, so usually a Boolean, a tiny int, are mostly used to be a 1 or a 0 to represent off and on. Alright, for instance, you may have a field in your users table called isActivated and have it as a tiny int, and if the user is activated it's a 1, if the user is not it's a 0. Alright, so that's mostly what tiny ints are used for. Small int can have a width of 5 digits, medium int width of 9 digits, and a big int can have up to 20 digits. We also have a float, which is a floating point number and can define length and number of decimals. Okay, so you can define those things. Double is a double precision floating point number, and then a decimal is an unpacked floating point number. So that's what we have for numeric data types. Next we have string data types. We have a char or char. It's a fixed length string, 1 to 255 characters in length, not required to specify a length, and it defaults to 1. Alright, next we have a varchar, which is probably the most popular string data type. It's basically a variable length. Remember, a char is fixed, varchar is variable. And 1 to 255 characters, and it must have a defined length. You must specify a maximum length. And a lot of times people just use 255 by default, which I do sometimes, but it's probably better to keep it, if you have an email address that's a varchar, maybe give it a maximum of 40 characters, even though sometimes I will give it 255, even though I know no email address is going to be that long. Just a convention, I guess. So next we have a text area or a blob. Basically, you would use this for maybe like a blog post, something like that, something that you're going to have a lot of data. Let's say you have an editor. For instance, WordPress, when you have the body with the editor, that would usually go into a text field. And it has a max length of 65,535 characters. Blobs can store large binary data like images, but I would not suggest that you keep images themselves in the database. You want to keep the location of the image and then have the image reside on your server. Tiny blob or tiny text has a max length of 255. Medium has a max length, you can see this number here, and then the long text or long blob has this huge number. And then we have an enum, which is a numeration. It basically is a list, and it's used to create a list of items for which a value must be selected. Alright, so that's string data types. Lastly, we have date. I'm sorry, this should say date and time, not data. Date and time types. Alright, so first we have a date, which is it's a date in this format. So we have the year, month, and day. So September 10th, 1981 would be stored as 1981-09-10. And of course you can use PHP or whatever programming language you're using. You can convert that into a readable date like this. In fact, in PHP, the date function, you can set it up. You can have dates however you want. Date time basically is a combination of the date and time. It has the same format as the date, but it also adds on the time in hours, minutes, seconds format. A timestamp is basically a string of numbers, and it represents the time between January 1st, 1970 and sometime in 2037. So it looks like the date time format, but without the hyphens. Like I said, it's like a long string of numbers. Time basically is just the time, no date, so hours, minutes, seconds. And then a year can store a year in 2-digit or 4-digit format. So those are the 3 data type groups and all the data types that we can use in MySQL. So in the next chapter we'll start to get our hands dirty and install MySQL on a couple different platforms, and we'll get started.